This is the very first Puritan pastor we're going to be examining together today, and his name is William Perkins. When I think of pastoral ministry, and I think of who in my mind would stand as probably the first quote-unquote Puritan pastor, it would be William Perkins. Now, as you can see by the dates in your notes, he conducted his ministry during the reign of Elizabeth I. So he not only is a Puritan, he is what we would call an Elizabethan Puritan. So he performed his ministry as a pastor in sundry capacities, all during the reign of Elizabeth I. And so it's going to be within that context in which he does pastoral ministry. Now, it's interesting. He was part of the establishment, and he pretty much worked consistently within that establishment, within the institutional establishment as defined by the Elizabethan settlement in that capacity. So, William Perkins, as you see in your notes, was born in Warwickshire. Now that's a little bit. Warwick is as you're going. You're going further north there in England. And from what we understand of Perkins' early life, at least by his own testimony and then by the testimony of some of his friends, he lived a very, very corrupt and dissolute life. It was a life in which he flagrantly indulged in profanity, drunkenness, and really every kind of vice that we can think of. We can, if we name it, he most likely did it. But probably the most prominent of his vices was that of drunkenness. And when I say drunkenness, I mean very, very chronic drunkenness, even to the point where he had developed a reputation for chronic and habitual drunkenness. In the meantime, on top of his drunkenness, he developed an interest in the occult. Now, just as a side note here, it's interesting to note that during the 16th century, somewhat during the late Middle Ages, but especially in the 16th century, the early modern period, late Middle Ages, Renaissance, there was a resurgence of interest in magic and the occult. So it would have been very common, especially if some very learned people, in the late Middle Ages, in the 16th century, to dabble with the occult and magic as kind of esoteric intellectual pursuits. And without going into all the details, because it would cause us to digress, this was a time in which even Christians dabbled to an extent in astrology. Now, in the 16th century and thereabouts, there was a very fine line between astrology and what we call today the science of astronomy. But nevertheless, even among Christians, there's this interest in various aspects of the supernatural world and then various ways of trying to probe that. And so Perkins is not the only one who dabbles in what we today will call magic or the occult. This was especially among the educated and among the and even some of the noble classes. This was becoming a common practice. Not to mention in England and other parts of Europe, people practicing various types of folk magic, which again will be mixed up with some folk Christian belief, which we also call syncretism. So, all that to say, when we see Perkins indulging in this kind of thing before his conversion, this was, believe it or not, a common practice in that world, even among professing Christians. And by the way, even among some Protestants. Philip Melanchthon, for instance, who was Luther's chief colleague and probably his closest friend at the University of Wittenberg, and himself obviously was one of the most important theologians of the Reformation, himself experimented with what you and I would call astrology. But again, we have to understand at that time in the 16th century, and here in the 17th, also 16th century here with respect to Perkins, this was a common practice even among some Christians. However, Perkins was apparently engaging in this for apparently very dark reasons, from what we understand. Well, in any event, in 1577, we see that he entered the University of Cambridge, where he would devote himself initially to the study of mathematics, earning his BA degree in 1581, and then 3 years later, his MA degree in 1584. Now, the account of Perkins' conversion is really quite profound and powerful. The process leading to his conversion began when Perkins himself, apparently recovering from one of his drunken episodes, overheard a woman in the street chiding her child for misbehavior. And in chiding her child, in reprimanding her child's misbehavior, she alluded to drunken Perkins. In her exact words, "If you keep this up, you're going to become just like drunken Perkins." So here's an example of a negative object lesson. Okay, Johnny or Susie, you see this infamous drunk over here? You see this person who's well known in the town as being the local drunk? If you keep this up, you're going to end up just like him. Do you want that? I mean, this gives a whole new meaning to what we may call a negative object lesson. Well, that affected Perkins quite poignantly. It so humiliated him to think that he's being used as a negative example to a child, that he suddenly, as a result, came under the conviction of the Holy Spirit, and he fled to Christ. Embraced him with only that supernatural faith that can be fostered by the Spirit of God, and instantaneously, he dropped it. His drunkenness, his propensity towards that ceased miraculously. his conversion was thorough. Because not only does he immediately forget his drunkenness, not only immediately does his propensity for excessive alcohol and drunkenness ends. He then dropped his interest in black magic. He drops his interest in black magic, and he even put aside his study of mathematics and hence devoted himself exclusively to the study of theology. Now, gentlemen, this is what we call a radical conversion resulting from the transformative work of the Holy Spirit. Well, he finishes his theological studies at Cambridge, and as we see here in the notes, he eventually becomes the preacher at the great St. Andrew's Church in Cambridge, where he served as really the main preacher and pastor there from 1584 to 1602. At the same time, in addition to his pastoral responsibilities at Great St. Andrews, he also served as a lecturer at Cambridge. And then it's in the midst of his academic career, which he is conducting simultaneously with his pastoral work, he serves as the dean of Christ Church College at Cambridge. He served specifically there from 1590 to 1591. And as part of his pastoral ministry, which, given his location, would have involved pastoral labors both within the church and among university students, he would take the opportunity on Thursday afternoons to catechize undergraduates at Corpus Christi College there at Cambridge. So he had so on top of his academic duties, on top of his pastoral duties at Great St. Andrews, he was also devoted to catechizing undergraduates. So he would set aside Thursday afternoons for the sole purpose of catechizing students, undergraduates at the Corpus Christi College at Cambridge. There was the method of education in the late Middle Ages, in the 16th century, which would have been along the lines of what we understand as the classical model. So there's that part of it. Also, another thing that would have attracted these are undergraduate students, and by the way, the typical undergraduates in the 16th century would have been somewhere between the ages of 14 to 18. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, just as a side note, the category of adolescence did not exist in the 16th century. So if you were 14 years old, 15 years old, you were viewed as something of a very young adult. There was no such thing. It was simply, in the 16th century, the stages of life were infancy, childhood, adult. That's it. There was no such thing as adolescence. Now today, at least in the West, I don't know about this part of the world, but in the West now there's a new category that's being added to the mix, because now in the West you have obviously infancy, childhood, adolescence, and now what they call emerging adults. So that's sort of the intermediate stage now, according to many sociologists, between adolescence and full-blown adulthood. But in the 16th century, it was very different. And I bring this up because in this day and age, regardless of whether it's in Ethiopia, whether it's in anywhere in the West, the likelihood of 14 to 22, 23-year-olds being all psyched up and excited about catechism would be somewhat remote. So then the question is, what was it that aroused the interest of these undergraduate students to be catechized? And most likely it was the ministry of Perkins himself. Perkins was from what we understand, we'll get into this momentarily, but Perkins was a very, very engaging teacher. He was a very, very engaging preacher and communicator. And most importantly, from what we understand, Perkins' life before those at Great St. Andrews and before students at Cambridge really manifested his walk with Christ. So with Perkins, there was the substance of what he preached and taught. There was the manner in which he did it. And then there was his life. So I would say, Michael, that the combination of these things really motivated students at Cambridge to receive catechetical instruction from him. Now, also as an aside, during the Elizabethan period, certainly during the early 17th century, in some cases, the Heidelberg Catechism was a required text for study as well. So that would also be a factor. As a matter of fact, we were talking over here yesterday. We were talking about the Heidelberg Catechism, and the fact that you're going to be incorporating that into Sunday worship. What's interesting, it didn't happen, but at some point there was a measure before Parliament to actually make the Heidelberg Catechism official and to append it to the Book of Common Prayer. So all that to say, the Heidelberg Catechism would have been very, very popular at this time in England, even to the point, in some cases, it would have been a required text in the universities, especially at Cambridge, since Cambridge is really going to be the academic center for Puritanism, and especially a particular college at Cambridge known as Emmanuel College. So for those reasons, we combine all those reasons together, and then we can see really then why students would have been so interested in this kind of catechetical instruction, especially by somebody of the caliber of Perkins. Great question. Go ahead, Emmanuel. Most likely, now there's a lot of questions as to when the conversion took place. Most likely, to be more specific, Emmanuel, most likely it would have been somewhere between 1581 and 1584. So most likely his conversion was before receiving his master's degree. Yet to answer your question, there already was a situation in the schools. Now, oftentimes it was, fully implementing it was hit and miss. But for the most part, by the time we get to 1570s and so forth, the schools are teaching Bible, they're teaching catechism and things like that on a regular basis. But then also, it was law. But also, it was law to go to church. So it was a matter. So it was a matter of the way it happened in Elizabethan England was in any typical town, if you skip church, if you didn't go to church, then in the parish you had, and in Anglican churches today, you still have these same positions, but in the Elizabethan church, you had what might be the equivalent of elders, or what we would call lay elders. But they were called wardens. So you had a junior warden, you had a senior warden, and the job of the wardens, in addition to just making sure that various needs for the church were being met in a number of areas, that the facility is maintained well. They are, ministering together the overall business of the church. Well, then they would also the wardens would also kind of keep tabs on the conduct of people in the parish. So if somebody's skipping church, well, then either the senior or the junior warden would go and investigate. They'd go to their house and they'd say, "Okay, Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones, why weren't you in church? Why weren't you in church for morning prayer? Why weren't you in church for evening prayer? When it came time for communion, why weren't you there?" And so there was that kind of accountability, and because it was mandated by law to go to church, if you didn't have a good answer, you'd be fined by either the junior or the senior warden would fine you for it. They'd fine you for skipping church. So all that to say, whether Perkins may have wanted, whether a pre-converted Perkins or his family wanted to or not, by law, they would have had to go to church anyway. At which point, then, Emmanuel, he would have been regularly exposed to the Bible, and the reason for that is that, going back to the Book of Common Prayer, whether it especially according to the orders of morning and evening prayer, there is a set schedule of scripture readings. So according to that set schedule of scripture readings, whether it be for both morning and evening prayer, through both of them, one goes through the entire Bible in a year through the reading. So typically, what would have happened is, somebody like Perkins and his family, they go for morning prayer. The scripture is read. The minister who's there would then preach a sermon on one of the readings for that morning, and then exactly the same thing would happen in the evening. There'd be a whole set pattern of readings for that, and they would be doing the same thing. There'd be those would be read, and then the minister would then give a sermon on that. So all that to say that even before that, there's on that level, Emmanuel, there's already this biblical knowledge that he would have gotten from the church. And and another factor to observe too here is that even though there are printed Bibles, most people wouldn't necessarily have owned one because of the cost. So therefore, any biblical knowledge one would have been received through worship at church. And then it would have been reinforced in the local school. Now, coming back to your question, well, all right, this conversion seemed, all right, he undergoes this conversion experience. It's not very long until he's apparently ordained, and then suddenly he's the preacher of this important church in Cambridge. Where did he get his biblical and theological knowledge from? leading up to this? Well, part of the standard curriculum at the university at Cambridge also included a lot of Bible and theology. So he already, especially in what is now a Protestant nation, he would have received already a significant dosage of this growing up, regardless of what his family was like, because his family may have been absolutely derelict on a number of levels, but under the various laws of Elizabethan England, as I said, you had to go to church. You had no choice. And if you didn't go to church, there were certain civil penalties that were exacted as a result. Now since we're on this subject, even today, technically, a minister or a priest in the Church of England, whatever nomenclature you want to use, by law, still has to do morning and evening prayer out of the prayer book, either before the congregation, or he has to do, or he does it on his own. But nevertheless, technically, it's still law for a minister in the Church of England to do his morning and evening prayer. And I remember. Oh my word! This was a long time ago when I did part of my study. I did part of my postgrad in England, and I remember talking to a priest in the Church of England, Anglican priest, and I remember him telling me, "Well, we were in some kind of conversation, and he kind of cut it short because it was sometime in the evening, and he said, "Look, I have to go and." I have to go and have my evening. I have to go through my evening prayer because that's my legal. Among other things, it's my legal obligation. So I know. You see, it's strange, and now obviously in England today, it's not. It's not mandatory law for people to go to church because the UK today is one of the least churched nations in Europe, if not the world. So, but at this time, it would have been. So for all those reasons, Perkins, to answer your question, Emmanuel, would have had heavy exposure to it, and whether he liked it or not, he would have had to study. He would have had to study at least some theology there at Cambridge. It just so happens that upon his conversion, he devotes himself exclusively to this, to the point where sometime after receiving his MA, he would have gotten what's called a BD, a Bachelor of Divinity. Because usually in the Elizabethan Church, the Bachelor of Divinity was what was necessary to become ordained as a minister in the Church of England. So typically what you would have done was you would have gotten your bachelor's degree, your MA degree, then your BD, your Bachelor of Divinity. And that would have been the minimal requirement to be ordained as a minister in the Church of England. And that was the case. That was the case with Perkins. Does that help? Yeah. So his conversion was somewhere between receiving his bachelor's and his master's degree. But he had already been exposed to a lot of Bible, a lot of theology, and things like that, even before. And if nothing else, just being there at Cambridge at the time. Human nature is the same regardless of the time period. Human nature. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's the 16th century or the 21st century. It doesn't matter if it's Elizabethan England or early 21st century Ethiopia. Human nature for the most part is still the same. So if you're mandating that somebody do something, no matter how good you may think it may be for them, there's going to be a certain degree of resentment. And sure, it's not like it is interesting, just to pursue your question further, James. There have been fascinating studies of how the Reformation in the Elizabethan church was popularly received. It was not, overall, and especially if you go back, and just to backtrack a little bit to the reign of Edward VI, the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer was 1549. When they tried to impose that nationwide, there was in the northern part of England, there was a massive rebellion against trying to impose that. So all that to say, already the reception of the Reformation on the ground in local towns, local parishes, especially in the northern part of England, was pretty rough. And at the end of the day, the country itself doesn't become, quote unquote, fully evangelical or Protestant until pretty late in Elizabeth's reign. So coming back to your point, given the fact that this is already, the reception was already, the popular reception of it already being somewhat mixed, there's already going to be some resentment. At the same time, there are going to be people who think it's great. Now, we in the 21st century look at this and we think this is odd. Not only do we think this is odd, we think it's tyrannical. But once again, we have to view this from the standpoint of the paradigm of a Christian society. In a Christian society, it's the state's well-being, it's the state's obligation to ensure the spiritual well-being of its citizens as well as the temporal well-being. And so, as a way of trying to help ensure the spiritual well-being of those in the Christian society, you make them do what's good for them. Go to church, because there in church is the repository of the means of grace. And it didn't, and I'm speaking now very specifically about evangelical/Protestant states, like England in this case. By the way, in Puritan Massachusetts, in colonial America, it's going to be the same thing. Although in the case of Puritan Massachusetts, there might be different reasons, but nevertheless, James, in that context, there's this idea that in a Christian society, the state has an obligation to do what it can to ensure the spiritual as well as the temporal well-being of its citizens. It's a totally different, again, this is a totally different world. It's a totally different world than what we would imagine, because once again, in the 16th century, they never would have imagined, they could never have imagined a Christian society kind of, in their mind, reverting and they can never imagine a non-Christian society, a society that becomes secular. Yeah, certainly they could appreciate and spoke about many times of a Christian society that has lived in disobedience because they knew the Bible. They obviously saw this to be the case with Israel. And there are many, many public prayers and proclamations all during this period, all during the 16th and 17th centuries, which would speak to that. But the possibility of a society, especially one that was a Christian society, suddenly mutating into one that's utterly secular, where Christianity has no role in it whatsoever, would have been an absolutely abominable thought. And so doing these various things was also another way of keeping the society Christian. That's another way of looking at it. Looking more at his pastoral ministry. So he catechizes undergraduates at Corpus Christi College on Thursday afternoons. Then he regularly lectured on the Ten Commandments. Now, again, especially within Reformed Protestantism, because we have to remember the Elizabethan Church was generally Reformed. They would hold to the same basic ideas of theology that their continental counterparts would have, whether it be Calvin in Geneva or Bullinger in Zurich or anyone like that. So we're dealing with a theological orientation that's generally Reformed. If you want to see an example of that, I would encourage you to read the 39 Articles. So you read the 39 Articles, it becomes very, very apparent that it's a theologically reformed document from start to finish. But nevertheless, in the Reformed tradition, as we know, there is a huge emphasis placed on the Ten Commandments. There's as the summary of the moral law of God. Within the Reformed tradition, as we know, there is an emphasis on what we may call the quote-unquote third use of the law. And so for those reasons, it would naturally lend itself in this context for somebody like Perkins to regularly be teaching through the Ten Commandments. Because at least in the Reformed tradition, as was getting defined in the latter part of the 16th century, the Ten Commandments serve as a guide by which then the Christian would live his life as a believer. So that would be the reason. It's interesting in the communion service of the Book of Common Prayer. And here I'm thinking the 1559, which would have been the one used in this period, and then the 1662 has the same thing. The service is always prefaced by the reading of the Ten Commandments. Very typical to what would be a very common Reformed service, whether it be Presbyterian, whether it be one of the Dutch Reformed. But interestingly, in the Book of Common Prayer, with respect to the communion service, which begins with the Ten Commandments, they read each commandment, and then the response is, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord, and incline my heart to keep this law." So, all that to say that the very fact that Perkins would be regularly lecturing on the Ten Commandments would have coincided very well within the Reformed tradition overall, of which then the Elizabethan Church was a part, broadly speaking. However, his pastoral ministry was not confined to public preaching and teaching. He also engaged in one-on-one pastoral care, and especially with students at the university. University students in the 16th century, just as university students today, whether it be here in Ethiopia, whether it be whether it be in Kenya, whether it be in Somalia, whether it be any place else, undergraduate students universally have their struggles. They're dealing with many, many questions and require someone to walk with them through it. Well, Perkins did exactly that with undergraduate students at Cambridge. He would actually lay aside Sunday afternoons for the sole purpose of counseling undergraduate students at Cambridge with respect to their spiritual problems. So here we see in somebody like Perkins, pastoral ministry consists, yes, public preaching, public teaching, yes, catechizing, as we've all been discussing, but then there was also this one-on-one time in which he would counsel students about their spiritual lives, one-on-one, individually, on Sunday afternoons. And he actually devoted his Sunday afternoons to that purpose. So we see here so far, in terms of pastoral ministry, Perkins took seriously both the public aspect of pastoral ministry by way of preaching, teaching, and so forth, but then there's also this one-on-one. There's this individualized aspect. And Perkins, just like Calvin, as you may remember from last week, Perkins would simply have viewed that one-on-one counseling time with students regarding their spiritual lives as an individualized extension of what he was publicly preaching and teaching. Well, if there are no questions about this, I want to just call to our attention here some other specific features of Perkins' pastoral ministry in general. Number one, as I think it's become quite apparent, he was an exceptional preacher. Even though he was a university theologian, even though he spent time lecturing to students on matters of theology, although he spent time catechizing students with regard on various topics of theology and things like this, at the same time, as a preacher, he also could reach the quote-unquote common people. He was such an exceptional communicator that whenever he preached, not only did his preaching reach the learned, the university scholar, the university students, their faculty, and so forth, his preaching also resonated with the average person who lived in the town, whether it be a shopkeeper, whether it be some kind of tradesperson, merchant, or something like that. One of his later biographers, Thomas Fuller, says this: Perkins' sermons were of, quote, many colors. They seemed to be all law and all gospel, all cordials and all corrosives. Now, a cordial is kind of like a sweetened beverage. So they could be all cordials and all corrosives, as the different necessities of people apprehended. In other words, he was able to reach many types of people in various classes, being, quote, again, to quote Thomas Fuller, systematic, scholarly, solid, and simple, all at the same time. Now then Fuller then goes on to say, Perkins' church, consisting of the university in town, the scholar could have no learneder, the townsman no plainer sermons. And most importantly, what made his pastoral ministry, what made his preaching ministry so effective in the lives of all different groups of people was the fact that he vividly, by the grace of God and by the power of the Spirit, illustrated his sermons with his life. As his preaching was a comment on his text, so his practice was a comment on his preaching. So, and by the way, he talks about, as you might have noticed in his Art of Prophesying, he talks about that. He talks about the necessity of study, the necessity of learning, but you don't display the learning with which you've studied in the pulpit. What you do is you bring before the people committed to your charge in the congregation, you bring to them the fruits and the results of you having used the tools of study, along with prayer, meditation, and so forth. And remember that your responsibility as a preacher is to reach. Easier said than done, that's why we depend on God's grace. But to reach as many people as possible. You're not only preaching to Josh, you're also preaching to the person who oversees one of the stands there on the street. Keep that in mind. Now obviously the demographic of every church is a little different. Some are slanted to one type of demographic more than another. But always keep this in mind when you're preaching. You're not just preaching to the most theologically astute, although you are. At the same time, you're preaching to the person sitting here who's the polar opposite. On the one hand, you're preaching to somebody who has a master's, a PhD, whichever else, is pretty well placed in somewhere, pretty well placed in Addis Ababa society. But at the same time, you're also preaching to those who do housework, who work in, as I said, who run various shops, and some of those and some of those who are standing there at a stand, selling any number of wares. And it's our job as preachers to reach both, without diminishing content, without diminishing exposition and application by any means, but at the same time we are under obligation to reach both. Easier said than done. But if God has called us, then He will equip and empower us by His Spirit. But an important part of that too, and Perkins would have stressed this as well, and that is, in order to do that, again, always by God's grace and by the power of His Spirit, we have to know the people in our congregation. And in order to know the people in our congregation, we have to familiarize ourselves with their lives and the context in which they live their lives every day. Because a pastor has an intimate knowledge of what's going on in the lives of the people committed to his charge. And then he's able, by God's grace, to bring the fruits of his study of the passage in question to bear on those sitting under his preaching. And it's in that way, brothers, that the preaching of the word does, by God's grace, show itself to be a means of grace.